Good morning, and thank you all for participating in today's meeting to review the Extended Day Ahead Market, or EDAM Stakeholder Working Group Organization and Logistics. I'm Christina Osborne with ISO Stakeholder Engagement Group, and I will be providing support for the meeting. Go ahead and review the agenda. So after I cover a few housekeeping items, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Rothletter, ISO's Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, to provide introductory remarks. And then Milos Besanik, who is EDAM Policy Lead, will give a high-level overview of the stakeholder process and working groups. He'll then turn it over to Phil Pettengill, the working group coordinator, and Emily Hughes, who is described for one of the working groups, to talk about the organization and logistics. And then the working group facilitators and policy leads will review the initial and draft scope items for each of the working groups. The working group facilitators include Mark Richardson, Deb Levine, Kevin Head, and then the policy leads are Danny Johnson, Partha Malzbekar, and Anya Gilbert. We'll go into more of the specifics about the roles of the coordinator, facilitators, scribes, and policy leads later on in the presentation. And then I'll cover the next steps at the end. The presentation is available on the EDAM initial webpage, as well as dedicated working group web pages, which we'll talk about later. There will be opportunities to ask questions, and I'll instruct you on how to raise your hand at that time, or you're welcome to send your questions in the chat as well. We are recording the meeting and will post the video file on the related web pages for informational and convenience purposes only. And just as a reminder, please contact the ISO before reprinting any related transcriptions. And with that, I'd like to turn the meeting over to our first speaker, Mark Rothletter. Mark, just make sure you unmute yourself on your end.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Christina, and I want to thank everybody for making your time available today. I know people are starting to think about the holiday season, and just appreciate your time. The ISO appreciates the amount of interest in the Extended Day Ahead market. As we heard from the industry leaders from across the West at the October 13th EDAM Forum, we continue to hear that this is an important initiative. We've taken this feedback as a call to action, and as a result, we have tried to assemble a robust open stakeholder process, starting with these working groups on the most substantive design issues. To achieve the objectives in the time that we would like to, we've committed ISO resources, significant ISO resources, and are prepared to start the work group process with a fairly aggressive schedule and cadence that allows individuals who want to participate and are committed to participate in multiple working groups to do so. We respect and understand stakeholders engaging in this effort have other matters and competing things that are competing for their limited time. So I just want to say that we are committed that during this process, that while we are starting with a strong cadence, we will continue to assess the progress and engagement to determine if we need to make any adjustments in the process and cadence going forward. I would just ask that you give us a little bit of time as we start, give us at least 2 weeks to see how things are going, see how the cadence is going, and see how the progress is being made. Lastly, I just want to thank you all for your interest and, more importantly, for your time and commitment to this process. We look forward to working with you together on a successful outcome, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised that we can achieve this when we all work together and make the commitment. So with that, I will turn it back to Christina.
Great, thank you, Mark. Okay, next up we have Milos Besanik, who's going to provide an overview of the stakeholder process and working groups. So, Milos, turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Christina, and thank you, Mark. Good morning, everybody, and thank you again for joining us for an early meeting to talk about EDAM. I know it's probably a little bit earlier than we usually have our stakeholder meetings, so we really appreciate you all taking the time and joining us here ahead of the holidays. The overall purpose of the discussion today is really to familiarize you with the organization and logistics of the upcoming stakeholder working groups, as well as introduce some suggested initial draft scope topics for each one of the working groups to consider as we prepare for starting that cadence in January. This list that we'll share today and an overview that we'll provide today may spur other ideas, topics that stakeholders may want to suggest, or even edits or removal of items from the scope of different working groups. But that will be done in one of the first tasks of the working groups once those start, to settle on the scope of items that each one of the working groups will consider and discuss over the 2.5 months. We hope that the discussion today will better prepare us then for the launch of those stakeholder working groups in January and really allow us to hit the ground running once we launch those working groups. I'm going to do a quick overview of the stakeholder process. Some of you may already have heard some of this on the November 12th workshop. Review the overall working group framework, including the different roles and the overall timeline of the EDAM initiative. I'm going to then turn it over to my colleagues to walk through the organizational and logistical aspects of the working groups. And then we will close out the discussion with an overview of the initial draft scope items that the ISO is putting forward for the working groups to consider initially. And these can be further discussed, like I said before, in those working groups, adding or removing certain items as the working groups decide. Let's go to the next slide, please. So those of you that had the opportunity to participate in the November 12th EDAM foundational workshop last month will probably be familiar with our stakeholder process on this initiative, and may be familiar with this slide that's in front of you. But as part of that stakeholder process, we're really looking to leverage stakeholder working groups to help us design core important elements of the EDAM framework. We recognize that there are different approaches, different options, and perspectives to consider when discussing each of these topics when shaping these core items that are subject of the working groups. And at the onset of the process, we want to allow for those discussions to take place, to attempt to develop a common framework that considers the different perspectives that stakeholders may bring to the table. There will be 3 working groups that will meet from January to mid-March, and the outcome of those working groups, or the output of those working groups, the design that may come out from those working group discussions, will feed into a more comprehensive straw proposal that will be published in the mid-April timeframe. The comprehensive straw proposal will, aside from including the elements that may come out from the working groups or the proposals that may come out from the working groups, will include proposals on other elements of the EDAM design, other items that are not necessarily part of these stakeholder working groups, and that we outlined during the November 12th workshop. That proposal will be then subject to stakeholder review and comment, which will inform future iterations of the proposal, ultimately targeting the end of 2022 for a briefing to the ISO Board of Governors and the EM governing body on the EDAM effort. 2023 will be dedicated to implementation activities, as we've noted in prior presentations, with ultimately targeting as early as 2024 to onboard any EIM entities that may want to participate in the extended day-ahead market. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, a little bit about the working groups. As I mentioned, we will have 3 stakeholder working groups at this stage. Working Group 1 will be focused on defining supply commitments and the resource efficiency evaluation in an extended day-ahead market. Working Group 2 is focused on defining transmission commitments and congestion rate allocation in an extended day-ahead market. And then Working Group 3 is focused on defining the greenhouse gas accounting and costs in the EDAM. These working groups will start meeting in January, as you will hear a little bit later, and they're open to all stakeholders. They're inclusive, and we encourage you all to follow these working groups as much as you can. We have a number of tools in place that you'll hear about today to provide robust transparency to the working groups and to ensure that if somebody's not able to participate on a regular basis, that they can be kept up to date with what's going on in each one of those working groups, as you'll hear about that later, and really to help you stay appraised of the progress in each of the topics. I'll also acknowledge that we heard from stakeholders in comments to the November 12th workshop about potentially having a monthly overall working group meeting to debrief and take stock of progress and provide an overall update for stakeholders as well as identifying interdependencies and topics among working groups. We're considering that type of a meeting. We haven't yet incorporated that type of a meeting into our process yet, but we're certainly heard stakeholder interest in that, and we're considering it, and we will keep stakeholders appraised if we are able to incorporate that kind of a monthly check-in on the working groups. I also will note that while we're starting these 3 working groups at this stage in January, throughout the initiative, there may be opportunities to stand up additional or different working groups focused on discrete topics. So we're keeping the door open to that. We'll see how the discussions progress, and as with everything, we recognize that things may arise where there may be a benefit in standing up different or additional working groups to help work through those items together. So we'll keep the door open for any additional potential working groups throughout the initiative. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, I want to briefly highlight the different roles in the stakeholder working groups, and the next slide will introduce the people behind those roles for each one of the working groups. But each working group will be managed by a facilitator. They will be responsible for guiding the discussion based on the list of scope items that will be derived by the working groups or affirmed in one of its first meetings, and they will look to drive the working groups towards proposals on the different scope items, or as close to proposals as possible, including alternatives. And we'll look to ensure different perspectives and ideas are heard in identifying aspects of that market design. Each working group will also have a dedicated scribe, and they will be supporting the facilitator and work very closely with that facilitator. They'll be responsible for capturing the discussion and evolution of the market design proposals on the different scope items in each of the working groups. And they will also be publishing meeting summaries, as you're going to hear a bit later in the presentation. We also have a working group coordinator role. That's a single person that will oversee the overall working group progression, and they will be working with the facilitators as well in ensuring consistency in working group organization and facilitation. And finally, I think it's important to acknowledge the role of all of you, the stakeholders, as working group participants. It is your engagement, your ideas, your perspectives that will help stimulate and drive discussion on the different topics in the working groups. The ISO will be one of the working group participants as well. We'll be ready to share ideas and perspectives for stakeholders to consider. So we really look forward to your engagement and your participation in the working groups. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, now let me take a moment to just introduce the people behind the roles that I just mentioned. You'll hear from a number of them today throughout the presentation. For Working Group 1, that's focused on supply commitment and the resource efficiency evaluation, Mark Richardson will be the facilitator. He's an account manager in our ISO Customer Experience Group. Bob Cott will be the scribe on Working Group 1. He's an operations policy manager with the ISO Operations and Analytics Group. For Working Group 2, which is focused on transmission commitment and congestion rent allocation, Deb Levine will be the facilitator. She's a director in our infrastructure, contracts, and management team. And Emily Hughes will be the scribe. She's a regional affair analyst in our external affairs group. And then for Working Group 3, which is focused on GHG accounting and costs, Kevin Head will be the facilitator. He's a market engineering specialist in our market analysis group. And Brian Jacobson will be the scribe. He's a manager in our enterprise model management team. And then we will have Phil Pettingale, who will be the working group coordinator across all 3 of the working groups. He's a director in our regional integration group as part of our external affairs team. I want to thank them, take a moment just to thank them for stepping into these roles in the working groups. They have had to reshuffle other projects and obligations to step into these roles as the working groups start, as I'm sure is the case probably with many of you in the stakeholder community that will be participating in these working groups. You know, a number of you probably had to reshuffle certain things to be able to participate, and we certainly appreciate that, and thank you for your participation. Let's go to the next slide, please. And I promise again here, this is the last slide for me before we get into some of the more substantive logistical aspects of the working groups. We just wanted to share the process schedule here on the EDAM initiative, recognizing that we have moved the working groups to start their full cadence in January, whereas previously in the November 12th workshop, we had that cadence starting in December. And as I noted earlier, the working groups start in January and they will meet through the mid-March timeframe, at which point the output of those working groups will feed into a comprehensive straw proposal that will be published in the mid-April timeframe. As is customary with our stakeholder process, there will be opportunities for stakeholders to participate in stakeholder meetings on the straw proposal, as well as provide comments to the straw proposal. And following that straw proposal, we will then largely look to follow a 2-month cadence or so of refinements to the proposals, going through different iterations of proposals in response to stakeholder comments, getting us ultimately to the December 2022 briefing to the ISO Board of Governors and the EDAM governing body. As Mark said, we recognize that this timeline is aggressive, and there will be opportunities for reassessment of this timeline as we start the working groups and as we publish the straw proposal and evaluate the stakeholder feedback. Okay, let me pause here then for questions before moving on to the next section, and just to give you a sense of what's coming up next in case somebody has questions in this section. But next, we're going to be talking about the working group organization more in detail and some of the logistics, and then we're going to get into the overview of the initial draft scope items for each one of the working groups for stakeholders to consider. So let's pause here if there are any questions on anything I mentioned in my presentation over these last few slides.
Sure. So if you want to ask a verbal question, you can, if you're logged into WebEx, you can select the hand above the chat window. If you just dialed into the meeting, you're going to want to press #2, or you're welcome to send your questions in the chat. We'll just give it a moment. I don't see anybody in the queue either.
Okay, thank you then. Let's move just onto the next slide, and I'll introduce Phil as the working group coordinator and Emily as well. They will walk you through certain organizational aspects of the working group. So take it away, Phil.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. Good. Well, good morning, everybody. I had a chance to sort of look through our attendees this morning, and we've got well over 200 folks on the call with us today. And so I recognize a number of familiar names. I wish we were all together and we could see each other and have those familiar faces as well. But glad to have you here join us. What I'm going to do is take you through a little bit of how we see the work groups being organized. And what I thought I'd do is just start off by observing, this is really a unique opportunity for all of us in designing the EDAM. And so with that concept in mind, what we wanted to do is think about a method that could help all of us engage and talk through some of these more complex topics, as Milos mentioned. And as Mark pointed out, it is a challenge for us. But what we wanted to do is use this concept of working groups to really focus in on these 3 subject areas that you'll hear more about. What I'm going to do is just sort of walk us through a little bit about how we're organizing the work groups. As you know, the ISO has a fairly well-established stakeholder process in regards to how we publish papers and seek feedback, but the work groups are going to move at a much faster pace. And yet what we wanted to do is still give a very much a similar feel and approach in each of the work groups, even though they have different topics. So with that, let's go to the next slide, Christina, because what I wanted to do is just sort of let everybody know or remind everybody how we're sort of setting up the work groups and why we're doing it this way. More importantly, how do you engage with this? And so what I've got here is the 3 different work group topic areas you see on the left. And then we've got a schedule set up, and all of those dates and times are going to be on the ISO calendar, so you can always look and find those there. But think about it from the standpoint that the supply group is going to be meeting on Mondays and Wednesdays, and you see the transmission group is going to be meeting on the Tuesday, Thursday morning, and greenhouse gas Tuesday, Thursday afternoon. We're going to start on January 3rd, right after the first of the year, and try to keep up this pace over those first 2.5 months. We do encourage you to register, and we've got the link for you here. Later on in this portion of our presentation, we'll talk about how we've restructured the website to allow for you to engage with us and keep track of the material, the content, and so forth. But here's basically what the schedule is. And we do encourage you to register primarily because we want to be able to reach out to you. And to the extent that we're sending information out, we then have a contact point for you, and we can make sure you're engaged with us. Christina, let's go to the next slide. So the way we're hoping these work groups to work and the way we really want to see these functioning is a very collaborative and inclusive approach. They are open to all stakeholders. So you're welcome to dial in, listen to the discussion, and we really do encourage active participation. To the extent that you as stakeholders want to create small groups and collaborate between you and then bring those thoughts and ideas into the larger work group process, we certainly encourage that as well. But what this really does for all of us is create a significant amount of transparency in regards to the discussion in these topical areas. So with that in mind, this is why we set up the facilitators. The facilitators are ISO employees, but I think you get a sense, and you will as we finish out our morning webinar with you today, these facilitators really are independent. And we're looking to the ISO subject matter experts as another participant in the work groups, just as you are representing your interests. The ISO can bring its thoughts and ideas to the table, and the facilitator can help with everyone engaging in that discussion. Our goal at the end of this period of time, though, is to generate a market design proposal. If we can reach consensus, we certainly would like to do that, but we also understand that there may be alternative approaches. And so with that in mind, what we want to do is capture those concepts in a summary report that would come out of each of the work groups. And that way, what you'll see is us on a weekly basis trying to summarize what the discussion is on those 2 meetings for each work group that occurred during that week. And then we'll capture all of that material and put it into a summary report that comes out of the work group process. Our intention then is to take that report and hand that over to the ISO design team, because as Milos mentioned, and you can see on our long-term project timeline, the ISO team is still going to be dealing with all of the rest of the EDAM design that is not included in our list of topics for the various work groups. So we do want to make sure the work group discussion and concepts get rolled into that straw proposal that'll come out later in April. So where are we going to start? Well, in the November meeting, we went through a series of these common design principles. And so, Christina, let's flip to the next slide. Because if we think about how to get started, what we'd like to do with all of you is in this first meeting of each of the work groups, want to review those design principles. And as Milos mentioned, consider any refinements. Are there things that would be helpful to you as our stakeholders to modify or change those principles so they're more clear, we can all understand them and work from those as we try to work for solutions in these areas. If there's additional items, certainly let's consider those and add them to the list. But the next thing we need to do, of course, is decide how are we going to approach these things. There may be a logical order or not. We may want to try to take some of the easier ones and take those first and take care of those, knock those out. So we really want to work with you in determining what is the full scope of the items and then what's the logical order for us to discuss those. So be thinking about that as you are preparing your thoughts and ideas for this first meeting or two so we can get started quickly at the beginning of the new year. We're going to have to constantly be on guard, I guess, if you will, because clearly there is a much larger design, which is the full EDAM. But the work groups are structured to try to help us with these 3 topical areas, which we know are difficult and complex in themselves. So we may want to think about, what's in scope, what's out of scope. But we also recognize it's possible there may be some cross-cutting issues between the work groups, and that's one of the roles that I'll play, is try to make sure that if something comes up in the resource work group that has some logical connection to, for example, the transmission group, then we're going to want to make sure we understand what those topics are that move between the work groups or have some logical connection. And then, of course, in that initial meeting, we're going to make sure we go through review that schedule that I shared with you just a minute ago, make sure that everybody understands what we're looking for from you and what our commitments are to you and supporting the work group dialogue. So a lot to do in the first meeting, but we wanted to give you a sense of how we see that first session going. Christina, let's flip the slide. So how are we looking for you to engage with us? Again, since the work groups are new and a whole new concept for us, but we're really pretty excited about this opportunity to really focus on certain areas. And the question, of course, came up, well, how best for you to engage with us? And I think the best way is what we've captured here. We want to commit to you that we've got an organization of the topics and how those topics will come up so you can understand where in the process to engage with us. So to the extent there are presentations, we want to get those scheduled. And those presentations may be from the ISO team or from yourselves. And we certainly look for stakeholders to bring to the table presentation material if that's helpful in trying to describe and work through some of the challenging issues we have. But during the course of the meetings, we're going to keep the lines open. We encourage you to help us manage that. But what we really want to do is pretty quickly be able to have you raise your hand, engage in the discussion, and help us move the topics through. Give us a heads up, and we're going to commit to give you a heads up on the topics that are coming. Later on, we're going to talk about how to propose questions or clarify topics for us. We want you to engage with us between the meetings by raising any of these questions and helping us prepare so that we can make sure that each meeting is as successful as possible. We're going to talk some more about the role of the facilitators and the scribes, but we certainly encourage you, if you need some information, if something's not clear or you want to propose something, we really encourage you to try to reach out to our facilitators and scribes. Make sure that we're hearing from you. And then, of course, in the case of the scribes, are we accurately capturing the conversation that you heard in each of these work group meetings? And so we'll ask you to look to those weekly reports to try to make sure that's happening. We are going to have a pretty significant amount of coordination that needs to go on. And that's why, again, we've got our facilitators and myself working with them across the work groups, because we want to make sure that we're making progress. And to the extent we need to adjust the agenda, we will. And we'll do that with your input and your help and concurrence on that. But also recognize that we are expecting the ISO technical team to actively participate in the work groups. And you'll hear some more from our subject matter experts here later on in the call today. So next slide, please. So let me stop here. And what I'm going to do is introduce Emily Hughes, who is one of our scribes, and ask Emily to sort of take you through what is it we're going to be doing in these reports and so forth that I've been talking about. So thank you. Emily?
Thank you, Phil. Good morning, everyone. My name is Emily Hughes, and I will be your scribe for Working Group 2, and I look forward to working with all of you. Today I will be going over the EDAM Working Group deliverables that each of the scribes will be working on. The first deliverable is a weekly summary report, and as the scribe, we will be capturing the key discussion points from each meeting. This is not intended to be a transcript or a meeting minutes, since each of the working group meetings will be recorded and posted on the EDAM Working Group webpage. The weekly summary reports will also be posted on the EDAM Working Group web pages at the end of each week. There will be one weekly report from each working group meeting that gives an overview of the 2 meetings that occurred that week. The second deliverable is the final summary report for each of the individual working groups. This final summary report will capture the discrete proposals on each of the scope items. In the summary report, we will identify areas of consensus, as well as capturing alternative approaches when consensus cannot be found. The final summary report will remain posted on the EDAM webpage for transparency and will be updated at the conclusion of each discrete scope discussion. This will be a living document that will track the evolution of each of the scope topics. At the conclusion of the working group meetings in mid-March, the final summary report will be handed over to the ISO policy leads to be incorporated into the comprehensive straw proposal, which will be published in mid-April. And stakeholders will have an opportunity to review and provide comments as part of our regular stakeholder process. Next, I will be going over the EDAM working group web pages where all this content will be posted. So each of the individual working groups will get its own individual web page. And you can reach these web pages by going onto the CAISO website. Under the Stay Informed tab, you can select Stakeholder Initiatives from the drop-down. And under all the initiatives, you will see the EDAM web page located there. Next slide. So here you can see a screenshot of the EDAM initiative web page. And at the very top, you can see a unique link for each of the 3 working groups. These web page links will remain near the top of the web page for you guys to easily access. And if you click on one of the working group web pages, next slide, this is an example of one of the working group web pages. Here you can see an objective of each of the working groups. You can see the leads, the facilitator, and the scribe that you can reach out to if you have any questions. And here's where all of the meeting recordings as well as the 2 deliverables will be posted. The initial scope item documents and an inquiry submission link will remain at the top of each working group webpage. This inquiry submission link is where you will submit questions and request to make a presentation. This is how you will reach out to the facilitator and the scribes throughout the process. I think this is where we will now pause for if you have any questions regarding the organization and logistics that Phil and I just went over.
Thank you, Emily. So we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. If you would like to ask a verbal question and you're on the WebEx, you can select the hand icon above the chat window. If you're dialed into the meeting only, press #2 on your phone. And you're also welcome to send your questions in the chat to all panelists. And it looks like we do have a question. Somebody in the queue, a hand raised in their queue, and we also have a chat question. So Chris, we'll go ahead and go to Kathleen.
Hey, Kathleen, your line is now unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vista. Thanks, Phil and Emily, for going through this. Really appreciate it. I was actually just playing around on the website too, making sure I could find it. So thanks for mapping it out like this. I had a quick question and wanted to kind of find out. I understand that, so this link to kind of get in touch with, you said the facilitator and the scribes are on each of those working groups. I've looked through a couple of the documents quickly on the scope and the principles and concepts, and I just wanted to give some feedback that I liked the simplicity and kind of how concise the documents are. I was wondering if, a couple things. I'm trying to think through the sheer enormity of what we need to follow quickly over the next couple months, and if there's a way to make it even simpler to kind of track the discussion items. And one thing that occurred to me that we might be worth considering is putting together a design matrix, like an Excel spreadsheet that has each of the kind of more refined scope items. So within a scope, are there specific market functionalities or processes that are in scope for discussion, and start tracking those in a tracking document where you could also provide very simple, like what's the status quo pre-EDAM, and then as the EDAM proposals unfold, we could have different columns for proposal from this party, proposal from another stakeholder, the CAISO's proposal. I think something like that would make it a lot easier to track rather than, in addition, because everything that Emily and you have described that you would produce seems really helpful. Just trying to think through if there's a way to kind of make a tracking document that would help the stakeholders follow it easier and also help us kind of think through proposals for each of the elements. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the best thing for us to do is take your idea, let us take it back and think about how we might work this in. Having a spreadsheet kind of format like that, to me, makes sense that it might work well in that summary report, because then we've actually got enough content to actually, be helpful to compare and contrast. It sounds like where you're getting at, but let us take that as a suggestion, and we can certainly follow up with you, when we get into this thing next year, beginning of the year, because we're going to need to move quickly. But I certainly see where you're going, and let's see if that works best for us. Thank you.
Thanks, and thank you for considering it. Appreciate all your work.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else?
No, we had a comment from BJ from WRA just saying he appreciates the approach of tracking progress made for each week and alternative approaches, plus scope and clarity and prioritization. So thanks for your comment, BJ. But there are no other questions.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, BJ. Thank you, everybody. So I think what we'll do, Milos, is we'll hand it back to you, because we're going to move into our next big portion, which is now hearing from the work groups themselves, right? So Milos, back to you.
That's right. Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Emily. Okay, so for the next section, as I mentioned earlier, here you're going to hear from the facilitators to provide a high-level overview of the working group purpose and objective, and then there will be individual policy leads from the ISO that will provide an overview of the initial draft list of scope items that the ISO as a working group participant is putting forward for consideration, and hopefully that initial list that's published on our website stimulates some initial thoughts from stakeholders ahead of those working group meetings, so that you can come prepared and maybe share some edits, additions, or potentially even removal of topics from scope, but so that it can facilitate that more robust discussion of those first meetings on the scope of each one of the working group items. So we'll have Mark Richardson as the facilitator talk about working group 1 with Danny Johnson, who's the policy lead from the ISO that's worked on those initial scope items. He'll provide an overview. For working group 2, we'll turn it then to Deb Levine, who's the facilitator for that working group, and then Partha Malvatkar will provide an overview of those initial scope items. And then for working group 3, we'll turn it over to Kevin as the facilitator to set the stage, and then Anya Gilbert, who's the policy lead, to provide an overview of those initial draft scope items. So with that, we'll turn it over to you, Mark, and we'll pause for questions after we go through each one of these individual working group topics. Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you, Milos. Can you confirm you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Richardson. I've been with the California ISO for a little over 12 years now. I am currently an EIM account manager for the Customer Experience Group. I've been given the opportunity to be the facilitator for Working Group 1, and I definitely look forward to engaging with all of you. While working through the various topics being covered in this group, we're going to strive to ensure that the defined principles are being accounted for and considered during our discussions. As you see here, the resource efficiency evaluation is one of those foundational elements that's going to be required to implement a successful EDAM. The purpose of the RSE is to ensure that EDAM entities have sufficient supply and flexibility to meet their own demand, uncertainty, and other obligations prior to engaging in mutually beneficial economic transfers. The working group will need to design key aspects of the evaluation framework to ensure that it is accurate and transparent across the entire EDAM footprint. These key aspects include, but are not limited to, how and which supply qualifies, and consequences for not passing the evaluation. Another key foundational item that I definitely want to mention that's not represented in these slides will be defining the level of certainty around transfers coming out of EDAM. Danny Johnson, the lead policy developer for this group, will be introducing that initial list of items that the ISO is putting forward for consideration. This list will be further vetted in our working group, as Milos mentioned, to either edit, add, or potentially even remove items. I encourage stakeholders to review the list and provide input during the meetings that start up here in January. I really want to thank everyone for their time. I look forward to working with all of you. And with that, Danny, I'm going to ask you to take it away and walk us through some of those initial list items. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. So for those of you who have not worked with before, my name is Danny Johnson. I'm a member of the Market Infrastructure Policy team here at the CAISO. I'm going to be helping to shepherd the supply commitment and resource sufficiency portion of the EDAM design. The objective of this is to ensure each participant brings to the EDAM adequate supply to cover their forecasted demand, reserves, and potential uncertainty needs, while also not dictating resource adequacy rules or requirements. When we started thinking about this, there's a few core questions that came up that we think need to be answered and will ultimately help direct the direction of the design. The first question would be, what qualifies as a resource for the EDAM RSE? You could put bounds on this question, which we tried to do in the two sub-bullets. Should a resource have to be modelable in our full network model and either bid or self-schedule? The other farther paradigm is, should a resource be able to be represented by a scheduled forecast adjustment to be more inclusive of demand-side resources, which may be part of entities' resource adequacy plans? We are also trying to figure out how granular and detailed of a test we want as a stakeholder community. I think the initial framework would look at an hourly test, ensuring that each entity can meet their demand and uncertainty requirements and variations between the hours. However, we would be open to less stringent tests to the extent that we can feasibly implement them and that stakeholders would have confidence that they are ensuring that all participants are coming to the EDAM resource sufficient. Next, I want to try and get a definition of what leaning means in the context of EDAM. I think that a lot of us have a pretty good understanding of what leaning means in the context of the EIM. Moving to EDAM, we're looking at a different timeline. Entities do have the opportunity to take additional actions bilaterally or internal to their system to cure deficiencies between the EDAM and the EIM. So I just want to ensure that we have a EDAM-specific definition of leaning, and we're not conflating the two terms, so we're all talking about the same thing. We've also heard a lot of discussion about how reliable the transfers will be coming out of EDAM. I think that we would strive to have them be reliable and all entities be able to count on them to meet their demand as they go into real time. To do this, we likely need to explore some level of ancillary service or minimum reserve requirements that would be either part of the EDAM itself or at a minimum shown as part of the EDAM's RSE to make sure all participants are comfortable that the transfers that they're getting as part of the market clearing process will be delivered. Finally, I'd like to explore the relationship between the EDAM RSE and the EIM RSE. If we have a happy path where all EIM participants were to join the EDAM, I think you could envision a scenario where passing the EDAM RSE with its demand and imbalance requirements could be a proxy for passing the EIM's capacity test. I understand that that sentiment may not be shared by everybody, but I think it's something that is worth at least discussing. Also, there is the potential for some entities to only participate in EIM and not participate in EDAM, so we would want to ensure any linkage that we have between the two would respect that and not disadvantage entities who are only participating in one of the market environments. I'd like to stop there and see if we have any questions on the high-level design items or core questions that will inform the design.
Okay, again, just a reminder, select the hand icon above the chat window if you're logged into WebEx, or press pound 2 on your phone if you dialed in directly, or also you're welcome to send your question in the chat. Looks like we do have someone in the queue, so we'll go ahead and take that question, Chris.
Stuart, your line is now unmuted.
Hey, Danny. Hey, Mark. Just a quick question. We have a lot of folks that are new to this particular topic. I've pulled together, some members to track it. As I saw pulling together a kind of synopsis of prior discussions or decisions that may be pertinent to each of these work groups, or even, potentially updating the initiative paper, issues paper, so that folks have, some context. I understand the importance of going straight into some of these questions given the time, but, for the benefit of the folks that are new to this and weren't part of the prior discussions and any decisions that may have been made today, is ISO any intention of producing some kind of synopsis as it pertains to each working group, or even updating the issue paper?
Stuart, thanks for the question. Regarding producing a synopsis, I would probably defer to Milos and Phil. I do think and agree with you that the issue paper that the ISO put out last year does touch on a lot of these items and would be a really good reference to familiarize yourself with these items for stakeholders who are coming into this a little bit new. We're trying to take a little different tack with these working groups. We understand that there's kind of an existing framework out there through that issue paper with some ideas around it. We think those will still be discussed as part of these working groups, but we want to be a little bit more open-minded, I guess, to other ideas that entities or potential participants want to bring forward. So I think reading those, going into this working group meeting, I know that paper has quite a long section on RSE, actually, which has a lot of ideas that we will be drawing from, would be a helpful reference.
All right, and then we do have another question from Kathleen. Kathleen, your line is now unmuted.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. And thanks, Stuart, for that question, because it made me realize I was assuming something. And so I decided to jump in and throw this out for the group to think about. And I think this might be more for Phil and Emily, Danny, so feel free to pitch it that way too. My assumption had been that, kind of along the lines with my suggestion to have, let's identify the design elements that we're going to focus on underneath these scopes, and then kind of anchor us in what's the status quo, is that would be kind of the first part of what the working group does, getting everyone aligned on what's status quo, and then providing and so part and parcel of what status quo is education on it, which is always great just to do as the first meeting to level set everyone before you move on. So I had made that assumption, so I wanted to throw that out there as a suggestion if that's not the plan, and I think that's consistent with what kind of Stuart was flagging. And I just appreciate if the CAISO team takes that back and considers that making education the first step in the working group. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathleen. And
maybe I can just step in here as well. And that's a great point, Kathleen. I think there will be opportunities as we settle on the list of scope items. I think there will be opportunities right at the onset to do a little bit of that level setting on some of these topics. Some of them will be fairly new, so that there's not that much of background aside from a reference to the EIM in terms of level setting. But for others, I think we can certainly provide an overview of how things maybe work in the EIM today, and what some of the previous thoughts were on each one of those topics. And I think that certainly once we start the working groups, some of that level setting, as we go from topic to topic, that kind of level setting can occur. So thank you for that input.
And Chris, I'm not sure if Stuart's hand is up from before, or if he had another question.
Sorry, up from before. Take it down. Sorry.
Just wanted to make sure, Stuart, you didn't have another question. And then we did receive a chat question from Laura Cholis. Will failure consequences be discussed?
So the answer is yes, and I think we'll talk about that a little more next slide.
And that was your last question, so we'll go ahead and go to the next slide.
Okay, so yeah, you can see failure consequences is a block here. So we tried to scope out where we thought this design would go and tried to break it into different components and buckets to help us focus. We ended up with these 4 buckets that we see here. Obviously, this is not the totality of the design and everything we'll need to consider, but we thought it was, at a minimum, a useful starting point. I'll get started on the top left. For the components of the test itself, we would look for there to be probably some type of capacity test as well as a ramping capability test. Those would work in concert to ensure each entity can meet their hourly requirements and then ramp between each hours. Again, this is just a starting point for discussion. We also would look to try and ensure that daily energy limitations and startup limitations of resources would be considered in this. That being said, the more resource-specific parameters we try to model and capture in the RSE, the more complicated it'll be, and potentially the more difficult it'll be to interact with. So that's something that we do plan to keep in mind. The final bullet here is a little bit of an outlier. It's timing requirements. Our goal is to maintain our existing market clearing timelines. I believe we close the market at 9, kick off the runs around 10, and publish around 1. All design that we would do would strive to keep this timeline in place. For resource requirements, we may need specific counting rules for different types of resources. Since it is likely a test across 24 different hours, the first type of resource would be variable energy resources. The contracted amount on a variable energy resource likely will differ from the forecasted amount on a variable energy resource, which will ultimately likely differ from the actual delivery and output of that resource as you get closer to real time. I think that imbalance reserves can help to bridge the gap between the day ahead and real time somewhat, so that will need to be accounted for, but trying to have counting rules for how variable energy resources are counted throughout the EDAM is something that we will look for this group to have input on. Next, there are imports from non-EDAM BAAs. Our understanding is that some potential EDAM participants may rely on these to meet their capacity needs. These types of imports may not have transmission at the time of the EDAM RSE. We want to try to develop rules about how these will be counted and credited and make sure everybody's comfortable with those rules. Due to the increasing penetration of storage resources, we likely will need to have storage-specific rules. Again, this is a 24-hour test. A lot of these storage resources would have a 4-hour maximum, or they're able to meet their PMAX for 4 hours. Is it appropriate to apply that PMAX across all 24 hours? Is it appropriate to only apply it across 4 hours? To the extent that it's not across all hours, is there somewhere in the middle that we can agree on how these resources should be counted? The final item would be the treatment of demand response resources. This gets back to that very first question about what resources that are counted. We do recognize that not all demand response resources that are part of RA contracts or forward procurement meet the modeling and telemetry requirements that the ISO has to participate as a PDR or RDRR. We want to ensure that demand response resources, to the extent that all entities are comfortable with their reliability, are able to participate and be shown for purposes of passing the RSE. Moving on to failure consequences. In EIM right now, we freeze incremental transfers in the direction of failure. I think this is a good starting point for EDAM. However, similar to EIM, I do think it is worthwhile to discuss financial consequences for potential failure of the EDAM that would allow that EDAM entity who may not have passed an hour or a portion of the day to still participate in EDAM and benefit from its optimization, while also ensuring that the entities that are kind of backfilling that resource insufficiency are adequately compensated for doing that. Finally, this last item, since the EDAM is going to be essentially giving a security constrained unit commitment for the entire footprint, there's a high likelihood that there's a lot more transmission constraints that are activated in the market environment as part of this as compared to, say, EDAM right now. We want to make sure that there's a common set of rules about the priorities for constraint activation, relaxation, and how this will work in the context of EDAM. The final bullet or final box would be RSE inputs. The top item here would be what demand forecast is used. Do we want a single forecast provider that is providing BAA-specific forecasts? Do entities want to use their own forecasts? To the extent that EDAM participants want to use their own forecast, do we need to have in place any incentives that would ensure that that forecast is accurate? Next, common AS and reserve rules. This gets back to making sure that the transfers would be reliable and all participants are comfortable with the transfers that they're getting awarded out of the EDAM. Finally, we do recognize that there are other reserve sharing groups within the Western Interconnection. We want to make sure that the EDAM design, to the extent that EDAM participants remain in those reserve sharing groups, respects those reserve sharing groups and accommodates those existing obligations. So I know I just dumped a lot of information on everybody, but I'd like to pause and see if anybody had any questions.
We do have one person in the queue. Just remind everybody you can select the hand icon above the chat window. If you're in WebEx, you can press #2 on your phone if you dialed in, or you can also send your question in the chat. So let's go ahead and go to Vijay.
Oh, can you hear me?
Jerry, yes, we can.
Thank you. If we go to the, sorry, this is all very helpful, but my question is from the last slide. This is an open question for CalISO staff and even the EIM entities. In my reading of the EIM entities comments in 2019, pre-COVID, there was a lot of ideas and positions expressed. So to make this weekly meetings efficient, is there a possibility that if there are a group of entities, whether it's EIM entities or others, if they have a position they're clear on, to come straight with their opinion or thoughts, or it's going to be free for all different opinions coming, and then there'll be consensus to be agreed upon. I'm trying to wonder if the EIM entities would have a thought process that one person could speak for the entire EIM entity's position, or it's going to be complete iterative, and then finally there'll be a response to the straw proposal. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I just feel this will help understand the key players' positions up front. Danny, yeah.
Yeah, I think that in the stakeholder process, or in the workshop process, we would welcome entities presenting their positions to the extent that there are entities that would support each other. It's good to understand where people stand. I think those comments would show that there are a lot of different positions. So this may give us the opportunity to have different sets of stakeholders who have different ideas, kind of commonly presenting where they stand, and then ideally trying to have a robust discussion and see if there's somewhere in the middle between all the different sets of ideas and priorities where we can all meet.
Okay,
thank you. Did I hear somebody else on my side jumping on?
Yeah, this is Milos. I'll echo what you noted, and I think we've emphasized it both in the November 12th workshop and maybe in my points that I made a bit earlier today. But we certainly encourage stakeholders to coalesce offline as well and prepare ahead of these working group meetings to the extent that there's common ground on certain items. It would be great if those entities could share those perspectives at the working groups, but we certainly encourage stakeholders to discuss amongst themselves and coalesce around certain aspects and share those presentations and that input during the workshops, working groups.
Cool, appreciate it. Sorry, I'll let you guys go back to the next slide. Thanks.
Thank you, Vijay. I think Kathleen is back in the queue, so we'll go to her next.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, this is Kathleen from Bistro. Sorry if you jumped in, but I'm like, these are all great questions. And want to share some experience with the group. I've been in workshops or working groups before that, and I'm not going to speak to if I think it's like super helpful, but I do think it helps, where the first step is called an interest identification brainstorm session. And so all of the parties of the working group or workshop, whatever you want to call it, in a specific effort, the first thing that is done is what I've been through is so you, the facilitator, ask the different stakeholders to provide what their interest is within the effort and then compiles that list. And that's something that anchors the group as they go in. It's not a consensus document. I want to be it's just a brainstorming session to bring out and illuminate the interest across the parties so that those are brought forward and all stakeholders have a level setting on what the various interests are as they go into the design piece. And generally after that is when I've seen working groups go through what are the design elements. I do want to note, Danny, slide 21 is fabulous and you did a great job. And I want to thank you for the thoughtfulness that you brought forward with this. This is essentially what I'm thinking when I say a design Excel document. It's these items broken down and then provided with what's the status quo today, and then we can keep talking about it. But I just wanted to throw out that interest identification can serve the need that was just asked for, and it's informal and it's not a consensus. It's just kind of bringing those forward so everyone's on the same page of what parties are interested in the effort before you get to the nitty-gritty. And I'm happy to chat offline with anyone if you'd like to hear more about other kinds of processes.
Yeah, thank you on both points, Kathleen. I think on the interest identification, that's a good idea. That might be something that we may be able to facilitate kind of through email offline going into the working groups, one of the concerns is we're doing everything just on such a truncated timeline that I don't know, using an entire meeting to have that type of discussion, it's something we'd be open to, but to the extent we can do that offline and then kind of present the results and then use that to anchor us, I think that would be something that we would be interested in doing. So thanks, Kathleen.
I think that's a great idea. Thanks, Danny.
All right, I don't see anybody else in the queue. There is a question from DJ. Can you elaborate on priorities for constraint relaxation?
If somebody activates a transmission constraint and it causes congestion in a different area, when would that constraint be unrelaxed? Also, what are the common rules around when transmission constraints would even be activated as part of this process? That's at least my initial thoughts on this.
All right, are there any follow-up questions? He said thanks. So that's all we have as far as questions on this topic. Thank you, Danny.
All right, well, thank you, everybody, and I'll turn it over to Deb.
Thanks so much, Danny. Perfect. Next slide was what I was just going to say. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Deb Levine. I've actually been with the ISO 24 years, so one of the longer-term people, and actually involved in the whole WPEX process, which put the ISO and the Power Exchange together. At the ISO, I've been the director over markets, over grid operations, MRTU, and I'm currently the director of infrastructure contracts and management, responsible for the generation interconnection queue. But I was also the project manager for putting together the transmission access charge back in 1999-2000. So have a strong background in transmission along with contracts, both from the CAISO side and then previously from the public power side. So the work group that I'm going to be heading up is transmission commitment and congestion rents and allocation. And what we're looking for discussion in that work group is what type of transmission service is going to be available to EDAM, because that's going to be critical in order to ensure that we have sufficient transfers between the various EIM entities so we can get the best optimization for the marketplace and for the users of the market. The second item that we're really looking at is for the transmission service optimization, how much of that is going to be, as Danny just said, available in the day ahead versus transfers that are not available in the day ahead and are only available closer to the EIM market. So the group is going to focus first on how transmission is made available and the quality of the transmission, and then how parties are compensated for the transmission to support the EDAM transfers. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Partha to go through the initial list of the scope items for the workgroup 2 and discuss the stakeholder review list. Thanks so much, and happy holidays, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. Can folks hear me okay?
We can. Thanks, Partha.
Oh, thank you. To jump at, Debbie really set the groundwork nicely here. Sort of as discussed in the EDAM Common Principles papers, we see this working group focused on transmission commitment and congestion rent allocation is really foundational to the goals of EDAM, and that really what we're really trying to drive here is sort of the key objective of how do we maximize the amount of transmission made available to the EDAM while continuing to respect the existing OAT frameworks and contractual commitments that are already made, as well as the FERC open access principles. So the two key questions that I think I really need to tee up here is first, how much is transmission required to be made available? Including sort of what are the mechanisms to make additional transmission available, as well as sort of what are the appropriate compensation mechanisms for that transmission. while set in stone, and we're certainly looking for feedback on this topic, and I'm sure it'll be part of the work group discussions. The original design in the EDAM Common Principles paper sort of built on the three bucket approach that was discussed in CAISO's previous EDAM proposal. At kind of a conceptual level, bucket one will consist of network and point-to-point transmission service that was used to meet load service as well as the resource sufficiency obligations. Bucket two transmission would consist of different types of transmission service that have been previously reserved by parties that was not otherwise made available in bucket one. The original bucket two concept was really built on the idea that the OAK customer would have a choice between scheduling all or part of their point-to-point reservations or to provide all or part of reservations to EDAM for optimization or do nothing. And so it had different options, and the idea was that that'd be made available in return for congestion rents. Bucket three is a slightly different modification on it, where it really consists of firm available transmission capability that was unsold, but we made available to the market in return for a usage rate. And this rate could be sort of previously approved posted rate or a discount rate at the discretion of the transmission provider. And that would likely be an item that would be discussed in more detail as part of the working group process. And as there's obviously some overlaps between issues that will be discussed in the resource sufficiency evaluation and the transmission side that will need to be coordinated on. The last bullet really sort of highlighting that there'll be some need to align on issues that will come out of the resource sufficiency evaluation and what's made available via sort of the bucket one transmission via those processes. So those are kind of like at least at a high level in terms of the transmission side of what will be made available and the topics that we have sort of scoped out around that. I'm going to flip to the next slide. And so these are sort of similar to the slide that Danny presented. These are sort of some of the different categories that I would look at on those topics. So I thought I might talk a little bit more about the congestion rent allocation design topics as well. I think that the primary work group discussion will likely need to be answer questions on, how to best hold transmission customers harmless without creating new uplifts, and what is a fair and efficient way to distribute excess congestion revenue taken as a part of the EDAM market design. The paper outlines some of the possible methods, such as having congestion rents allocated or congestion rents associated with EDAM transfers between EDAM entities, split 50-50 between these areas. I think that type of element will need to be discussed and vetted in more detail as a part of the working group structure. And so, again, no final determination, but I think these are some of the details that will be fleshed out. I'm kind of going into more, I won't go through each of these topics separately, but kind of at a high level, these are like some of the 4 buckets that we really thought that will need to be addressed as a part of the working group design in order to have it be sort of a good functional design as well as implementable in the system. I'm kind of starting from the top right, the timing and duration, I think will be at least a key element that will need to be addressed in terms of what is sort of the timing of making available, what is sort of the length of service that we provided via these different transmission allocations. There's sort of various things in terms of the compensation we touched on before. There'll be sort of various implications beyond that in terms of the settlement implications, how is this actually operationalized in the market that will need to be touched on and addressed as well. So I'll probably stop there for questions, but yeah, really appreciate the engagement by folks on this topic. It's obviously a lot of challenging issues, but yeah, really looking forward to active engagement by participants and sharing thoughts on how we can come to workable and compromised solutions. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. So if there are any questions pertaining to this working group for Partha and Debbie, you can raise your hand by selecting the hand icon above the chat window. If you're on the phone, press #2. You can also send your question in the chat. We'll just give it a moment. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody in the queue. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and turn it over to Kevin Head to go over the Working Group 3 scope item.
Hey guys, confirming that you can hear me.
Yes, thanks, Kevin.
Great. Hey, my name is Kevin Head. I'm a market engineering specialist here at the ISO. Been here for about 2.5 years. I'm also a certified public accountant in New York State, and I hold a master's degree in environmental economics. Looking forward to coordinating these working groups with you folks and facilitating some good discussions on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'll discuss the scope first, but I think it's important to understand why we're discussing greenhouse gas accounting in the first place. It's important to acknowledge that greenhouse gas policies vary widely across the West, and that a well-designed EDAM should account for these policies consistently. In particular, I think a major topic of conversation will be accounting for the emissions embodied in energy that transfers across state borders. Doing so, it's not a simple proposition, and it needs to factor in the ongoing conversations that have been held over the past few years around this area. So I see this scope having kind of two main questions that we'll need to address. The first topic is sort of a ground-up question of, should an EDAM factor in greenhouse gas costs arising from carbon pricing policies? Assuming the answer to that is yes, which is the case with the current EIM, how do we build this market? There's the first primary question of, how do we build the market optimization? Some thoughts around this are, could be a resource-specific attribution, which is how the EIM works today. There's also ideas around using an unspecified rate, or there might be a third option that we haven't yet discussed, at least in the context of the ISO's market. Assuming that we have an answer to those, there'll be a secondary set of questions that we'll need to sort out, such as cost allocation and settlements, discrepancies between political geographic boundaries and the balancing areas themselves. How do we handle multiple greenhouse gas policies? For example, Washington has the legislature passed the cap and invest program. How do we incorporate that into the market? Separate from California's cap and trade program. And finally, we'll have to figure out how we roll over the results of an extended day-ahead market's greenhouse gas costs into the real-time EIM market. The second is kind of an attendant question, which is, say we do have an extended day-ahead market, are there any policies within that EDAM that will affect how carbon reporting works under the current paradigm that is operating in the West? The carbon intensity of energy is particularly relevant for renewable portfolio standards, but it's also relevant for carbon pricing regimes. For example, it's possible that intertie bidding can be affected by the EDAM's implementation, thus impacting how ETAGs work, and thus the verification requirements that entities use to verify their renewable energy credits. So we might need to consider an alternate tracking mechanism around how energy is tracked across the West. So those are the things that I see this scope covering, but I'm happy to hear other folks' thoughts on this. And Anya has a good detailed set of scope items that she'll discuss. So I'll turn it over to Anya Gilbert. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So as a quick audio check, can folks hear me?
I can. Thanks, Anya.
Great. So Kevin gave a great overview of why we're examining greenhouse gas emissions in the context of EDAM, and I'll be previewing some of the key questions and design topics that the working group is going to work through. Our key objective, or North Star, is to account for greenhouse gas emissions and costs equitably and consistent with state policy. And at a high level, this can be broken down into 3 questions. What are we accounting for? How is this going to be captured? And in addressing both of those design topics in EDAM, how are those entities equitably treated, regardless of their greenhouse gas compliance area or what we're referring to as their greenhouse gas zone. Next slide. So as a click down of the greenhouse gas topics, we're bucketing this into 4 key areas. And I'd like to discuss these 4 key areas and then give a flavor of what topics the working group will be discussing within these 4 categories. Those include accounting, equity, market efficiency, and the cost and settlements. So from an accounting perspective, and this is going to be our largest bucket, what is the compliance area? Will it follow the same design established in EIM at the state level? Or do we need to re-examine the area at the LSE, balancing authority, or greenhouse gas compliance area level? Second, how are we going to account for secondary dispatch in EDAM? Least cost dispatch is going to do its job, and low greenhouse gas emitting resources are going to flow to areas with a greenhouse gas compliance obligation. And when this occurs, secondary dispatch of other resources backfilling to serve native load can occur. How can we best quantify the greenhouse gas emissions associated with secondary dispatch in EDAM? And related to the development of counting secondary dispatch, how can we develop a base schedule that best serves as that point of comparison? Another topic will include how we consider emissions rates and under what types of participation. When should it be resource specific versus unspecified? Lastly, how do we best align with existing greenhouse gas compliance tools like renewable portfolio standards and assure alignment? Under the equity bucket, in developing EDAM design and these accounting rules, we'll be looking at how we best ensure a level playing field regardless of greenhouse gas zone and minimize leakage. When it comes to market efficiency, when we are developing these greenhouse gas accounting rules in EDAM, we'll be doing so in a manner that still promotes market efficiency and considers the interactions between day ahead and real time. And from a cost and settlements perspective, depending on the design, we're going to be examining how the cost recovery of compliance for entities outside a greenhouse gas compliance area are administered and what the settlement rules are in place. So I'm looking forward to the discussions in the working group and welcome questions either for myself or Kevin on the greenhouse gas compliance working group.
Thank you, Anya. We do have Kathleen back in the queue, so we'll go ahead and go to her first.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Thanks, Kevin and Anya. I have a request for the working group discussions that I'd like to make for the CAISO to think about before we get started. So my understanding of what the Regional Integration and EIM Greenhouse Gas Compliance Initiative achieved back in 2018 was a refinement to the prior greenhouse gas paradigm, and that there's that a part and parcel of that effort, one of the things that was done was considering how, if other areas in the EIM were to adopt greenhouse gas compliance, how the functionality that was being designed and adopted in that prior effort, the Regional Integration and EIM greenhouse gas, could be scaled up. And the third, one of the draft final proposals actually uses that as one of the benefits, right, of why we went about adopting that functionality, was that it could be scaled up. So I think part of where I would assume that we would start in the working group with a review of what that functionality is, and the understanding that it is scalable to any new greenhouse gas compliance program, and then an identification of if what you're raising here is that there were assumptions made that works for real-time imbalance but doesn't work for day ahead, kind of specifying that so that we can track it as a stakeholder group. And I hope that makes sense. And I'll just kind of summarize it. Is that if we've already designed a program that's scalable to all the areas, then I think the problem statement isn't how do you expand greenhouse gas compliance integration into the market. It's how do we ensure that what we designed for real-time imbalance works for the day ahead, EDAM. And if that's not the right understanding of the problem statement, I think refining that and explaining why we no longer have faith in that design that we adopted is the case when we start the working group. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. We will be reviewing some of that prior history and prior design and looking at that scalability. So I think that's an area that we will be addressing.
And it looks like we have another question in the queue.
Your line is now unmuted.
DJ, don't forget to unmute yourself on your end. Are you there?
Yes.
Chris, can you see what's going on with VJ's audio? Oh, he lowered his hand. And VJ, you can always also send your question in the chat if you'd like. So while VJ's queuing up, there was a question about the pace of the initiative, and Milos, if you can respond to that question that we received in the chat.
Sure. I think the question is from Carly Page, and the question is, what is the constraint that requires this swift pace? As I understand that we all want an EDAM ASAP, but is there a specific driver looming? And so I think Mark Rothleader addressed this in his introductory remarks as well to a certain extent, but we want to maintain an opportunity for an potential EDAM start in 2024. We've heard from a number of entities across the West for the desire to make progress on EDAM to flesh out what that market design is for parties to consider whether this is an opportunity for them as early as the 2024 start. So we want to maintain a swift pace for completing that design and allow sufficient time for implementation and testing. But as we've noted, we'll assess progress and pace as we launch these working groups, as we go to the straw proposal phase. We'll always keep an eye towards potential need or reassessment, but we wanted to keep this swift pace at the onset.
Thank you, Milos. DJ, he did send his comment in the chat. Hold on one second. Let me request about RPS alignment. There are some states with RPS that have used for GHG reductions in accounting. This can make things complicated. Recommend there be ways to consider areas of alignment with RPS or potential divergence. In other words, GHG accounting may require separate process practices than aligning with RPS. So thank you for your comment, DJ.
Yeah, hey, Christina, I'll just hop in. Thanks, VJ. I think it's a good comment. We don't want to get into the details at this point, but it's something that we'll definitely be discussing in the working groups. Whether we want to incorporate that tracking in the EDAM or have a separate process. That's something that we'll discuss in the working groups. And then, Kathleen, to your point, agree that is, a good question and something that we'll also consider in the working groups. So thank you both.
Okay, great. Thank you. I don't see anybody else in the queue. So Milos, is there anything you want to close out with before I go to the next steps?
Yes, I just wanted to take a moment to, again, thank everybody for taking the time to make it to this discussion today. We really appreciate it. We hope that you found it helpful and that some of this overview and an introduction sets us up well for when those working groups start in January. I do want to note that while you've seen, summaries of these of the different initial scope items in these presentations, we have posted a slightly more detailed document for each one of the working groups that lays out that complete list in question form, provides a little bit more intuitive detail on each one of the topics, and we posted that on each of the working group web pages. So take your time when you have a chance, look over those, and start thinking about Are there any aspects that are missing within each one of those working groups that would need to be considered? Is there something that maybe doesn't fit into that working group, or is there some consideration of how we want to frame an issue that we need to consider that you're not necessarily comfortable with how it's been framed in these documents? So start thinking about that and in preparation for the working groups. And like Phil and others noted throughout the presentation, in our first meetings, we will be focusing on these scope items, vetting it with stakeholders, and ultimately coming to a common list of items that we can then organize in some intuitive order to address throughout the working groups, and hopefully develop some consensus around some of those components. So at least on behalf of the ISO team, we want to really thank you for your participation and joining us, and we encourage you to participate in the working groups. And if you have any questions ahead of those working groups, on the EDAM webpage for each one of the working groups, there's a way that you can submit questions or inquiries to the facilitators and the scribes ahead of the working groups with any kind of ideas or inputs. So we really appreciate it, and thank you again for taking the time. Christina, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. We did have Dan Williams join the queue, so let's go ahead and take his question.
Hi, thanks, Christina. And Milos, question maybe for you, might also be for Phil or for others, and kind of two related questions here. This is Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. So the first one is just whether we can, as we're diving into these working groups, whether we can make an attempt to capture some of the assumptions that have to be there related to touch points that exist with other initiatives. And I'm thinking just kind of early on of day-ahead market enhancements, the transmission services and market scheduling priorities initiative, RA enhancements, energy storage enhancements, and then maybe most importantly for working group one, kind of what assumptions are there and where we're going to land on some of the EIM resource efficiency enhancements, both the phase one items and some of the phase two activity as well, where that may be going. And then I guess related to capturing some of those assumptions is just an open question around how those other initiatives are going to be managed around these EDAM working group meetings in the early part of 2022. I know in the annual plan meeting, there were quite a lot of other things on the calendar for January and February, and just kind of asking what the CAISO's plans are for managing those, and then for being coordinated between some of those key initiatives that do impact the EDAM design work.
Thank you, Dan. This is Milos. I'll respond, and then others can jump in if needed. But let us, on your first question about some of those interdependencies and connections, I think laying out that at the onset of some of the working groups, let us take that back and think about that, how best that can be weaved into those working groups, and we'll consider that certainly. In terms of your second question of, the myriad of other things that are going on at the ISO and how that, how we will manage that, I'll acknowledge that there are a lot of things going on, and we do have a robust team participating on the EDAM effort from the ISO that is also participating in a number of the other initiatives. So we're certainly discussing internally those interconnections and interdependencies between initiatives, and we hope to bring those out in straw proposals, external stakeholder discussions. But we also are going to be mindful in how we schedule certain meetings, particularly over the next 2.5 months, recognizing that the working groups are meeting with a fairly frequent cadence, twice a week, all three of them. We're going to be mindful in how we schedule some of the other engagements with stakeholders, and to avoid any kind of overlap with the working groups, and just keeping an eye on that, making sure that we're not overwhelming the stakeholder community with everything that's going on. It is going to be a challenge, but like I said, we're aware of that, and we're keeping an eye on it, and we'll look to ensure that there's no, or limiting any kind of impacts or conflicts in terms of scheduling meetings and scheduling discussions. So hopefully that helped, Dan.
Yeah, that's great. And just, as a stakeholder in this process, it just would be great to the maximum extent that you can to try and keep a firm calendar and give more than a week's notice, if you can, on how some of the other initiatives are progressing so that folks can kind of plan their time around that, before we get back to in-person where, we might be getting back to a, kind of 3-week ahead meeting notice schedule like we used to have a couple years ago. And on the assumptions part of it, just baseline things like kind of timing of the day ahead market, products that are being discussed in DAME, those sorts of things. I just think it'd be really good to make sure that all 3 of the working groups are sort of working from the same baseline expectations in some of those touch point areas. So that's what I had in mind there. But thank you, and excellent meeting. Look forward to getting going on this in a couple weeks.
Appreciate it, Dan. Thank you. Thank you. Great suggestions.
Right. Any other questions before we close the meeting? I'll just cover a couple of next step items. As Milos mentioned, we do appreciate you reviewing the scope items, the initial scope items, and providing any suggestions or feedback. There's a link out there. We created some inquiry form on each of the working group pages, so you can provide your suggestions there, and you can also indicate whether you're interested in presenting at a future working group meeting. And I provided links to the working group web pages here. You can also find them on the main EDAM page. And also, as we mentioned earlier, we will be launching these working groups the first week of January. There will be 2 meetings per week for each of the 3 working groups. And the specifics for those meetings are on the ISO's public calendar. And just another reminder that if you'd like to register for these working group meetings, there's a link out on the working group web pages and the EDAM web page, and that's so that we can keep you informed on upcoming activities. Any other questions before we conclude? All right, I'm not seeing anybody in the queue, so thank you all. We really look forward to your participation in these working groups and working with all of you, and we wish you a happy holiday season. Thank you.
That concludes the conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.